Good afternoon and welcome back to another ironic introduction to another video. Today I want to give my thoughts on Act 6 and my exploration post-nerf, as well as my thoughts on class gates. You might be a little surprised, but that's what I really want to dive into is those class gates. As always, there is a timestamp in the description if you want to jump ahead, as well as just like a brief disclaimer that I am exploring or did explore Act 6 after the nerfs. I had done 6.1 before, as well as 10 to 12 paths of 6.4.1 and 6.4.2 for Tier 2 Alpha, just the easy paths. But for the most part, my perspective on Act 6 is post-nerf. And honestly, I don't want to dive into some things too deep because I feel like Kabam has addressed them in Book 2, Act 1. So there are things I'll mention, but then I'm going to jump over just because I feel like it's already been addressed. So the first one is the grind. It was grindy. Act 4 was grindy. Act 5 was grindy. Act 6 was grindy. No shock. I do feel like this was addressed in Book 2, so while I think it sucked in Act 6, all I want is just an energy drop. Just lower the cost of energy in Act 6 and Act 5 already. It's just so much energy. It's so frustrating. But beyond that, I feel like this has already been addressed in Book 2. And then next is that I feel like overall Act 6 was really reasonable. And understand that this is coming from a player with a stacked roster. And I get that it's not going to be the case for everybody, so feel free to disagree, but at least from my perspective, having the right answers in a lot of the situations, and some of them not even that niche, just top tier champions that everybody wants to have, it was actually really reasonable. The thing is, I cannot even process what it would have been like to take on this content without Ghost and without Quake. I cannot even fathom how much different it would be. That is how often I was using those two champions. So I will say that part, which is a huge flaw, but I also feel like that was addressed in Book 2. So while I do think it's a huge flaw of Act 6 and I want to talk about it, or mention it at the least, I'm not going to get hung up on it because I do feel like it's been addressed already. The next thing is specific fights that felt like they needed a niche counter, or specific paths that were just overall totally just BS. I had a few instances. The first one was in Act 6.4. There's a life cycle path where I felt like if you didn't have Domino, it was just a brutal path. I think it cost me like 12 or so revives, give or take. And it sucked. It really did. But I want to say that overall, I felt like even then, that's not too bad. I strong-armed my way through it with like Warlock, and it wasn't that bad. There was a Thunderstruck path, I want to say in 6.3 somewhere, that was particularly annoying as well. That one I do feel like needs to be addressed just because due to the restriction of the roster and then the fights on the path is just absurd. It was really just a very frustrating path. So that one I do think needs to get addressed. I think it was in 6.3. But otherwise, while I ran into frustrating paths, there was never a moment where I felt like if you have the right answer, this path is too bad. Yes, there's issues with the restrictivity of the answers, and in that regard, I'd like to see some addresses, some more addresses, but even with the wrong answers, and on a lot of the paths, I brought wrong answers purely because I wanted to do it faster, or I didn't want to rank up a champion if I didn't have to, see Domino, and so I just pushed through with the wrong champion, and it still wasn't too bad. I think the last major note besides the life cycle path, the Thunderstruck path, is the Do You Bleed paths, where I felt like if I didn't have Aegon, it would have been a way more frustrating fight, way more frustrating path. Do You Bleed paths were actually really, really, really reasonable. If you had Aegon, you just hit into their block. I do think that's what they were going for. They wanted you to come and hit into their block. I feel like we have Massacre now, who does decent. I jumped in. My Massacre is like rank 2, but I did see pretty decent gains there, so I found that to be pretty reasonable as well. My biggest thing is we just need more options. We just need another 2 champions that can really, really respond hitting into the opponent's block and get some really good damage through the block, or a way to circumvent the Do You Bleed anti-counters, because they literally go out of their way to make it so you don't want to bring a bleed champion. And as long as we get that, I felt like they were pretty reasonable, especially given where they were, because like one of them is in the 6.2.6 fight. And yes, it's an Emma Frost who can't be armor broken, so yes, you're going to be hitting into her block, but essentially, once you've turned her back into the telepath phase, her block proficiency is garbage, and you just pummel into her block. She goes down super quick. Another one is Killmonger. That fight's a little annoying because he does have once he launches an SP1, he goes unstoppable. But that fight also wasn't too bad. It's actually a really clever play, and arguably would have been less frustrating for players if it turned out to be the boss rather than if it turned out to just be a fight on the path. But given that you take like 4 gates with Aegon, it overall just really isn't unreasonable. My biggest thing is that what they had done is they had taken these frustrating paths outside of Thunderstruck, and they said, what's a champion that people really, really want, really, really rank up, and then they super inflated their value just by making it so you felt like you had to have that champion to deal with it. Aegon is one of them. He's huge for Labyrinth of Legends and Abyss of Legends. Everybody wants him, and you should just honestly just wait to do those 2 Do You Bleed paths until you get Aegon. And that's the frustration I have. That's what I'd like to be addressed, but I don't think that needs to be fixed with going back and changing the content. I think that can very readily be fixed with new champions, and we're already seeing that. We're seeing 6.2.2 Mr. Sinister be way easier now that Warlock is out. My biggest thing is that at least going forward, I would like for Kabam not to retro solve these problems by releasing champions, which is the methodology I believe they were using going forward, and I think that's being changed going forward in Book 2. But at the time, that was their solution. They said, content is static, new champions will come out, and then it will be easy. And players were like, no, what, F you, and that's just how I feel. But I think that's been addressed, and I think that overall that's getting changed. So in general, my too long didn't want to watch timestamp here. Act 6 was reasonable. It was grindy. There were moments where you felt like you needed a specific champion, but overall, about 85% of it was just a grind. It was reasonable, but grindy. The other 15% was frustrating and a total unit hassle, but not so expensive that I felt like it couldn't be readily solved with some arena grinding. So that's how I feel about Act 6. That said, I want to talk about class gates. Now, up until 6.2.5, Mortal Quest, I actually really liked the class gates. The implementation of them really worked to the benefit of the players for the most part. It felt like you always had class advantage, and it did feel like there were a lot of options in the classes to either counter your lane, or if you didn't, you could at least, you only had to bring 3 in the worst case scenario up until Mordo, where you could at least use the other 2 slots to bring like a boss counter as well as maybe an answer for your lane if you really needed. So overall, I think up until Mordo, it was super fine. Once it got to Mordo, this is the part where I got triggered, and I literally said 6.2.5 is the stupidest content I've ever seen. It's something I said. And the reality is, it's not the class gate. I have no problem saying bring 4 cosmics. It was that the way they had designed these fights on this path, that it felt like, oh, you have to bring Medusa here, or oh, you have to bring Ghost here, or oh, you have to bring Warlock here. It didn't feel like, oh, you have to bring a tech champion, or oh, you have to bring one of 7 tech champions. It was, you have to bring this one specific champion. That's what bothers me. That said, I think that there is a lot of potential for the value of class gates. And Kabam, if you're listening, please listen for just a quick second. Class gates could do so much to benefit the future and longevity of Marvel Contest of Champions. They were implemented wrong here, but that does not mean they are bad for the game. That is where I stand, because up until Mordo, I thought they were really neat. It was a clever way of finding excess synergies maybe I didn't use normally. It was a cool way to find options in the class that maybe I didn't use super often that suddenly were the best in slot because I had to, and there was a lot of potential in that train of thought. It wasn't until here where I really felt like it was specific one champion needs due to the pathing that I got frustrated. And the solution to that is, one, already exists. The allowing players to swap in a champion before a boss node, really good solution. It really opens up that roster, so even if you've had to bring 4 techs, it's not as bad. The second one is, I think, always keep it to 3. I just feel like 4 is a little too much, at least right now. 3 is pretty reasonable. I didn't have any frustrations on that, but 4 is just too much. It just gates you a little too hard. And then the last note is, I think that they're being used in the wrong way. I think right now the point of the class gate is to restrict your roster, only just pull you tight and prevent you from utilizing the better options here and force you to really look for 1 or 2 niche options, hardcore RPG focus. And what I think it should be is a way of empowering a class. Rather than seeing it as a restriction, class gates can be coupled with positive feedback nodes the same way Cavalier Event Quest works, where there's kind of a class gate on Cavalier Event Quest, but you can bring any champion you want. That can be done here in future content. Is just put a positive feedback loop and then empower champions of that class with utility that they might not normally have access to. So a really good way is something similar we see is skill with the Mixmaster and the anti-evade, with every time the opponent gets like a damaging debuff, shock, incinerate or something, they have minus 100% ability accuracy for evade. That is amazing. Put that in the content. Put that in static content. Put a skill gate in the content. Say you have to bring a skill champion, and then say every time the opponent is debuffed, skill champions get a 12-second or 8-second true strike buff, you know, and suddenly all the skill champions have anti-evade. You could do that same concept and say every time a mutant champion gains a prowess effect, they gain a true strike buff for 8 seconds. Now all of the mutant champions with prowesses have true strike, and then you put a mutant gate on the path so that people aren't bringing anti-evades anyways, because otherwise they could just bring Ghost, they could just bring Killmonger, they could just bring Nick Fury, but now they have to eyeball their roster and they go, weird, I never thought I'd be using Havoc versus Spider-Gwen. I never thought I'd be using Havoc versus Spider-Pig. That's a bad example actually because of the specials, but my point stays the same, where suddenly you can make mutants interact in the same way you would typically make skill champions, and that is the real value of positive feedback loops as well as class gates. You can empower the mutant class by preventing other classes from stepping in and overpowering them. Because normally, mutants being anti-evade isn't their strong suit. That's a skill thing. Mutants are like prowess and they've got immunities and stuff. But if you empower them with anti-evade and prevent people from bringing skill champions in, suddenly people are evaluating mutants on a different level and utilizing them in situations that they wouldn't be. And that is going to be a great way to add 6-fold the number of utility potential for your game. That is where I'm at on class gates. There is so much good potential for interesting and clever content, just kind of crossing the lines, blurring it a little bit between the Cavalier Event Quest and class gates. So I love it. I hope we see these in the future. I hope we see them in a way where it empowers a class and it can take champions that typically might not see the light of day in a certain scenario and suddenly make them best in slot to deal with that node. And I think that would be amazing. Let me know what you think. As always, this is just for fun, but I hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you all later. Peace.